How is information used and abused in small communities? What do we know about the disinformation campaigns influencing the opinions of our neighbors, family members, and friends? And what can we learn about the role of disinformation in the 2020 election and the January 6th riots at the US Capitol? Well, let's meet the folks who will be part of the conversation today. And I ask that you briefly tell us a bit more. So in 2 minutes or less, how did you come to the work that you're actually doing? So first we have Patrice O'Neill, a filmmaker and CEO of the Oakland-based nonprofit strategic media company, The Working Group, and the leader of Not in Our Town. Her film, Not in Our Town, began as a half-hour PBS special and turned into a dynamic movement to stop hate and build inclusion in communities across the US and around the world. Patrice.
Hi, AB and panel. I'm so grateful to learn from my fellow panelists and from the amazing group of leaders that Dee Davis has helped to assemble over these many years. For me, 25 years of engagement with communities across the country in the fight against hate, I've seen over and over again that there are vital solutions and untapped potential emerging from local communities that can help us overcome some of the deepest challenges facing our country. So I look forward to learning from the people in this gathering. We need you now. And if you watch the news, the threat is apparent. The FBI reported 51 hate crime murders in 2019, the largest number since they started aggregating hate crime data in the early 90s. 23 of those lives were lost at a Walmart in El Paso. But it goes beyond the killings. I've heard from my Asian friends who've been spat upon, called coronavirus, and who are worried about their parents and grandparents walking to the store. So as a way to introduce myself, because I know this is part of solutions, how do we overcome these conspiracy theories and misinformation of calling coronavirus the China virus? How do we address it? I'm going to tell you just briefly a story about Not in Our Town and where it came from. It emerged from a story we did about people in Billings, Montana, who were standing up to hate. There was an organizing drive of white supremacists in the Northwest, and they wanted to declare Billings to be their homeland. And people there knew that they had to do something, or more and more people were going to be attacked. So when skinheads started showing up at a very small African-American church in town, members of other denominations were there to support the congregations and the congregation, and the skinheads went away. When a Native American woman's home was plastered with racist graffiti, 30 members of the painters union showed up to paint it over, and 100 neighbors were there to watch. So the town started learning there are things we can do together. The culminating event in the story took place when a 6-year-old Jewish boy placed a menorah in his window for Hanukkah. A brick was thrown through the window, it landed on his bed, and people knew that this was getting more dangerous. So they said, what if we're all Jewish? And so they started making these paper menorahs, passing them out at the dry cleaners in the quick way, putting them in their windows. The local newspaper printed a full-page menorah, urging people to put it in their windows. And that year, 10,000 people put menorahs in their windows in Billings, Montana. And there are not 10,000 Jewish people in Billings. It was an end to the white supremacist terror in that town. Hate and violence didn't go away for sure, but it worked. And that kind of community action, that civic action, understanding what each of us can do, led to a movement that people started identifying with after they saw our film. And I think it is that impetus of a community to see what they can do together is what I'd like to talk about as we get to solutions to this deep problem of disinformation and hate speech.
Okay, Patrice, thank you. And our next panelist, Laura Quinn, was a founder and currently serves as president of Catalyst, and that's List with an I, Catalyst LLC, which is owned by a not-for-profit trust and provides comprehensive voter data and related data services exclusively to progressive civic organizations. And Laura, you actually collaborated with a group of philanthropists in 2019, correct?
Yeah, that's right. they were mounting a big effort to push back against disinformation. They had done a prototype project in Europe right ahead of their EU parliamentary elections in 2019 and had some success. So they actually then got together amongst themselves and then supported a federation of organizations that were doing work to push back against disinformation. And you asked how I came to this. I've spent a good part of the last decade and a half, two decades almost, looking at data about the civic life of primarily the US and how voters are behaving, which way they're voting, what issues are they're engaging on, all kinds of data about voters. And we have been watching over the last 2 decades more and more polarization in the country. But it accelerated pretty dramatically in the last 5 years. And the extreme sort of points of view that were coming through in a lot of the data that we were examining, and the voters' voting behavior really shifted pretty dramatically in 2016. It took a lurch. Usually things in the civic space move pretty gradually, but these kinds of moves in the behavior of voters were pretty surprising and shocking. So we did what we always do. We looked at the data to try to correlate it with what might be causing voters to really move in such dramatic ways. So we looked at all the things that we love to collect data about, like income level and race and ethnicity, and whether jobs were moving into your county or moving out of your county, or whether robots were replacing people around you, whether there's more immigrants or less immigrants, all the kinds of demographic and socioeconomic data to try to explain why were people shifting around so much and why was there so much more extremism. And the thing that really got me very much engaged in this particular issue is when we started to look at something where we hadn't been collecting data, which was what is your source of information? That really, some of the economic stresses were they were giving us a pretty good explanation. Some of the other racial resentment issues were giving part of the explanation. But when we started to look at where people were getting their information from, there was really new strong correlations. Now, I wish we had the data going back in time, but part of the reason why we weren't collecting that kind of data is, frankly, everyone was getting their information from one large information ecosystem that was all connected. Everyone was sort of seeing a lot of the same news. They were getting a lot of the same reports. And now we are, in the last 10 years, we have moved into a different kind of information arena, where we have different information bubbles that people are inside of, and they're not seeing the same set of information. And that is going a long way to explain a lot of the extremism. And the mechanics of that whole system is having a bigger effect on people than we think. And to tell you the truth, I actually felt a little bit relieved when I started to see that data, because it really makes you recognize that this isn't all coming from a purely organic place, that these are not just merely latent, serious problems that this country has to address, which is clear, but it is also being artificially amplified and stoked in ways that are very destructive to social cohesion and destructive to being able to do the work as a society that we all know that we need to do. And that's why I'm heads down on this until we get done what needs to get done.
I think you're on mute, Evie.
Here we go again. Thank you very much. And Hari Khan is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute. That's the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Political Science and faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. And Hari, you specialize in the study of organizing movements, civic engagement, and democracy.
Right. Yeah, thank you. First of all, just let me also echo Patrice and say I'm so happy to be a part of this panel and delighted to be in conversation with you all. I'm grateful for the opportunity for what I'm sure will be a fruitful 45 minutes together. Yeah, so I wear a couple different hats. I direct an institute called the SMF Agora Institute that's dedicated to strengthening democracy all over the world, with a particular focus on the notion of the Agora as being fundamental to making democracy work. And the Agora are the kind of places where people come together in their communities, whether they're digital or in-person communities, and gather with each other to figure out how they can create the world that we want. And I think that historically, we've always known that that's fundamental to making democracy work. But one of the trends that we've seen in recent years is that those agora-like spaces have become hollowed or emaciated in the ways that Patrice and Laura have already described to us. The information ecosystem is fundamentally a part of that agora, that civic space and that interstitial space where people come together. But there are also other parts of it too that I think hint at some of the kinds of solutions that we can point to. And in terms of how I got into this work, I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas, and I was born in the United States, but my parents had immigrated after they were, in their adulthood. And I think a lot of what I saw growing up was my parents trying to figure out what it meant to raise a family in the U.S., like how they could make it, quote unquote, in the U.S., whatever that meant. And I think that kind of imbued with me this sense that part of what's so important to all of us as humans is this question of how do we become architects of our own future. And I think that's fundamentally what these kind of civic spaces that that democracy really is about, is this question of how do we bring together people of all different kinds and figure out how they can all put their hands on the levers of change and trying to sort of make a better life for themselves. And so that's a lot of the work that we do at the Agora Institute and also my own research lab.
Okay, great. Patrice, Laura, and Hari, thank you. And so, disinformation in rural America, is it somehow different than disinformation elsewhere? And Laura, I'll toss that to you first.
Well, the information diet that is predominant in large metropolitan areas and the one that is predominant in the rural parts of the country have become increasingly different and untethered from each other. You used to have, sorry, let me get rid of that. You used to have an information system that was really very well connected. You had, large wire services, you had national networks that were feeding local affiliates, you had local affiliates that were doing news gathering of their own and passing it back up that food chain. So you had a lot of cross-pollination. And that is really, broken down for a whole variety of reasons. The economic system that supported local newspapers has collapsed. The local television stations have vastly disinvested in gathering news. So they're relying more and more on packaged up news that come from national outlets, whether that be national networks like CBS or from cable news networks, or they're actually, the local stations are now taking news feeds from national newsrooms for the Sinclair broadcasting system and then the Nexstar broadcasting system. So the news gathering in local places is not happening. And what that is causing is the impression that urban dwellers have about rural America is really not very accurate. The interesting thing that the data tells you is that when you ask urban people about rural America, they think it's in terrible shape. They think there's a meth epidemic, which is a serious problem in rural America, but their impression of how that is destroying communities is perhaps outsized to the reality. And the belief that there aren't healthy rural communities anywhere isn't kind of almost an urban myth. You have a similar phenomenon in rural America, where the impression that rural Americans often have about urban America is that everything is on fire and there's nothing but violence. So the impression in both directions is being warped by the fact that news gathering is not locally owned anymore and is not being locally produced and isn't rich and really high quality. So that in and of itself is creating sort of two different ecosystems. It is also true that from a partisan point of view, the news ownership in rural America is much more in the ownership hands of companies that have taken a much harder conservative or hard right conservative point of view. That started with talk radio, and it's really now spilled over into local TV affiliates. And as I say, print is largely disappearing. While you might say that in urban metropolitan spaces, there's a much, much more liberal point of view, a much more progressive point of view. So you have those megaphones, those news instruments no longer giving you a blend of both. You know, each part of the country is getting a more and more kind of customized narratives suited to reinforce what they may already believe, but maybe even not just what they already believe, but that are also promoting a particular point of view and causing it to be more deeply adopted in both of those places.
Right. And that's actually a very interesting point about, the relationship between disinformation in rural America and misinformation about rural America. And Hari, when we were speaking offline, you referred to this disinformation as a crisis. Could you tell us a little bit more? Why is it a crisis, and why should we be so concerned?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because on the one hand, we could sort of say, if we look back at American history and our political history, that we've always had disinformation, right? Yellow journalism has been a thing from the very earliest days of journalism, as they say, and that, we've seen actually really vitriolic things that political candidates, that political parties, all these things that we'll say about each other, and that's not unchanged. I think what is different, I think there are two reasons why I think that, actually maybe three reasons that I think that is particular now. So one is what Laura already talked about, just the sort of fragmentation of the information ecosystem is different now than what we've seen in the past. And so locating the sources of the disinformation is a much bigger challenge now than it used to be. Second, it's the speed and scale with which information is moving nowadays. And so we've always had disinformation, right? But when yellow journalism used to spread in the early 1900s, let's say, it wasn't moving at the speed and scale right now, where right now what you have is a situation where a piece of disinformation goes out into the public sphere, and then people react to it and then make decisions based on it in real time, even as it's spreading throughout different networks. So the speed and the scale, I think, make it different. And then the third thing I would say is something that is a little bit different, which is sort of this question of what makes people so susceptible to disinformation right now? In my like nerdy academic terms, I would sort of say like, what's the kind of political economy of disinformation? Like, what makes it work? And there's a lot of research that shows that people are more susceptible to disinformation when they feel more powerless, right? Because what the disinformation does often is that it helps people develop explanations for why they feel unhappy about their current circumstances, whatever those circumstances might be. And so there's this question of also, as we see kind of rising rates of inequality and a decline of social cohesion and like all these other kind of ills that are afflicting our society, that people are more susceptible to disinformation in a way that is less likely in a society that has more equity across it. And so I think that there are sort of several dimensions to the reason why I think this is a sort of different crisis than maybe one that we've had in the past. And just to kind of like your last point, why is it a crisis? Well, democracy is fundamentally about people coming together to solve public problems. And if people can't even agree on basic facts, it makes it very hard for us to develop the kind of the social cohesion, the kind of commitment to a common good, the sort of motivations that we need to do the hard work of trying to work together across to solve these kind of problems.
And Hari, when you talk about the speed and scale, there also isn't that filter. I mean, people are getting, and this speaks to what Laura was talking about as well. People are just getting this raw information, and before, when people were relying on the wire services like Reuters and UPI and AP, there was a little bit of a filter. So that's really very concerning when we've actually lost that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way in which like there are no more referees, in the system, and but if you think about like almost every sport or game that we have, or kind of like, system in which people kind of have to cooperate with each other in different ways, you have to have some referees every now and then. And we've sort of lost that. And we certainly don't express in a shared set of referees. And so I think that's, that's an important reason why within this unfiltered marketplace, it not only makes it easier for those ideas to kind of spread, but also the quality of the ideas is challenging.
And I think there's one more factor to throw on top of this, which probably leads right into what Patrice was talking about, which is the consequences. So not only has the information system been sort of breaking in two, where you have urban America getting one version of what's going on and rural America getting another version, but on top of that, the information is now being distributed basically through two railway systems, Facebook and Google. So whether you're looking at the New York Times or you're looking at Breitbart or you're looking at anything in between, very often it's being distributed to the largest part of the audience through one of those two rail systems. And those rail systems are not giving a blend. They're not doing what old network television used to do, which is like show you a bit of everything. They are in fact doing something very, very different. They want to hold your attention, and attention they know from watching how you behave, and they are watching all of us every minute of the day that we're online. They know that attention is best grabbed by showing you things that are extreme and sensational. So they have a hand on the knobs here. They are turning up the extremism that's on the edges of our society and pulling it in and putting it front and center. And if you start to lose attention, they will go out and grab something even more sensational and put it in front of you. So that is a new, it's not just that you don't have a referee, you don't have firemen helping put out the fires. You have folks with flamethrowers trying to light up the fires. And that is another part of the problem that we don't have to have. And pushing back against some of that extremism, I think, is what Patrice was talking about, which is the best way to combat that extremism is not to rebut it, it's to push more positive information in front of folks. And the best way for that to happen right now is, as Patrice was describing, engaged communities recognizing that the extremism that they're seeing is not organic and that they do have agency to push back against it. One of the things that's also true in the social media space is, believe it or not, individuals prefer to share happier news. The algorithms prefer to share sensational and extreme news. So that is part of the understanding of the way the new information system works that needs to be better understood by the public, because they are being acted upon and they are losing their ability to, act themselves. And I don't know if Patrice that.
But you know what? I actually before we go to Patrice and solutions, you brought up social media, and I was going to save this for later, but I want to read this now and get your thoughts on this. And this is an editorial written by Wyatt Emmerich, and he is the president and CEO of Emmerich Newspapers, which operates nearly 25 newspapers in Mississippi. And I read this in the Wayne County News in Waynesboro, Mississippi, which I call my hometown newspaper since I used to spend my summers there. But he wrote an editorial very, very critical of Donald Trump and his actions as they related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And so Emmerich writes, Congress was attacked by the monster it created 25 years ago in 1996 when it passed Section 230 of the Communications Act. That act gave internet companies legal immunity from anything they published on their social media platforms. It was one of the worst decisions in the history of Congress. Every publisher in the history of publishing has been legally liable for what they published. My company is liable for the contents of every ad, every article, every letter to the editor. It should be. Congress ignored 500 years of libel and slander, common law, and exempted internet publishers, sowing the seeds of the social division we see today. And the rabble attacking Congress had visions of global conspiracy theories dancing in their heads, conspiracies posted by fakes and charlatans posting as legitimate journalists. Your reaction, and Laura, we'll start with you.
Well, I think I agree with the publisher from Mississippi. You know, Facebook, Google, these information systems are products, and products that cause harms are usually forced to remedy them and, you know, install safety features and safeguards. They're required to raise standards. And the fact that the social media platforms have gotten a complete pass at this point, I think is, you know, ridiculous and needs correction. And I don't think that everyone in the public is always completely aware of how Wild West it is, you know, on Facebook, inside of these Facebook groups. But just to give you the most basic kinds of examples, you can't commit fraud and sell medicines that hurt people through the mail. You can't sell guns on television. You can't collect information about children as they're watching television and sell it to other people so that they can market to them or do worse. And all of those things and so many more, you know, sale of babies, endangered species, you name it, it's happening on Facebook right now with very little oversight, no transparency, and being managed by a set of executives that have not demonstrated any responsibility for what their products are causing, both in this country and in even worse ways, you know, around the world. So I think I am wholeheartedly in favor of new standards, higher quality, and more safeguards for the public for this product, just like any other product.
Ari, new standards, are they needed?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with what Laura said. And I think the kind of bigger point that both from the editorial that you read and also what Laura was describing to us is the fact that the construction of the information ecosystem that we have is a series of choices that people have made over time. It's a series of choices that executives at the tech companies made, a series of choices that government has made and how they're going to interact with the tech companies. And so it doesn't have to be so, right, is the point. And that I think part of the challenge then is how do we begin to help people understand that there's a series of choices that are inflaming the kind of information that we're receiving, the kind of society that we're creating together, and then think about what is that actually the design of the information ecosystem that we want. And I think most of us would say, no, it's actually not what we really want. And the question is, how do we reclaim and find, design a different kind of information ecosystem that works for the people and not just for the railways, as Laura was saying.
Okay, so solutions that work in fighting the disinformation campaign. Patrice, when we spoke, you said, you know, trying to go troll to troll just don't work. That it just won't work. That's a failed strategy. What do you mean?
Well, I think you have to look at you have to face what's happening and the things that that I think everyone here is describing. They're very specific pieces of information and this toxic stew of both dangerous speech and conspiracy theories that are living online. And they need to be exposed, right? They need to reach the light of day so that in our real world, in our real lives, we can fight them together. I'm working on a film now about Pittsburgh in the aftermath of the attack at Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 people were murdered. And the conspiracy theory that we started, that men walking down the street in Charlottesville started to vocalize, Jews will not replace us, helped drive this man, according to his social media posts, to go and murder 11 Jewish people. And he chose that synagogue because of their support for immigrants and refugees, right? And so this idea that Jewish people are trying to replace white Europeans with with people of color and immigrants is a really dangerous conspiracy theory that needs to be, I think we need to understand it so that we can fight it in the real world, so that we can give our young people, our community members, the tools to understand just how ridiculous it is, but how deeply harmful. And to really understand, Susan Benish, if you haven't seen her site, she runs a project called the Dangerous Speech Project, trying to identify the level of speech that has led to mass murder in the past. And it's particularly when we dehumanize people, when we dehumanize each other, when we call each other insects or animals, or make that comparison, that speech becomes particularly dangerous. And then there is this effort to, which I think we've seen in the Capitol riots, which is to say the enemy before us is so much unlike us that they are not really the same level of human that we are. And so I think we have to face those things and get that out in the open in order to understand the threat that we're facing, and to realize what our young people are seeing when they go into gaming sites, right? To see the level of recruitment and not just misinformation, but really harmful speech that children are being exposed to under the guise of jokes. Do you want to come into a joke site, right?
Jokes and memes and things like that. And Patrice, you talked about providing people with the tools that they need, and it kind of relates to a question from a viewer, asking, how do we hold companies and politicians and their campaigns and news organizations accountable? And that speaks to this idea of what tools do we actually need? That's probably part of it. And Hari, I saw you nodding your head. What sort of tools are available to people to get a better understanding of what disinformation is?
Well, so I think, I think that probably a lot of the work that Patrice is describing that she's doing is the kind of thing that we've seen be most effective. So just to kind of reinforce what Patrice said at the very beginning, one of the worst things you can do to combat disinformation is to throw more information, at people and try to convince them with the sort of power of your facts and logic that you're right, and instead, it's about sort of embedding people in a set of social networks where people, trusted social networks, where people who they trust kind of reclaim together both the information that they're receiving and how they interpret and make sense of the information that they see. And I think that so the solutions and the tools that people have are really right there before us, right? It's about what are the ways in which we are connecting with each other? What are the kind of settings in which we invite people to come and try to interact with each other across the kind of lines of difference that we're increasingly seeing more, less and less of. And, I think that, sometimes when people think about, solutions to disinformation at the level of communities, so everyone wants to have like one tool that we can use across like a magic bullet that we can find. And I think the magic bullet is not there because it has to be tailored to the specific circumstances of a community. And so what, people that grew up in rural Texas, that I knew when I was growing up are going to need something different than what people in Baltimore, Maryland need, which is where I live now. And I think that we should look for that magic bullet. But instead, the kind of question is like, how do we identify the people that can be like the kindling that light the fire? Like who are the people in communities across America who are like that kindling? And then how do we light the match that sets that kindling on fire, which then they heat up the log to sort of set the bigger log on fire? I think those are the kind of questions that we need to be asking. And then also I should just say, and that is alongside also regulating the big companies and stuff like that too. So I think there's both a bottom up and a top down solution that we need to do in parallel to each other.
Somewhere we meet in the middle. Well, that leads to another viewer question. I live in a very rural area of the Arkansas Ozarks. Our local news has been effectively shut down, and is a small percentage of the information we use to what we used to have available. My question is, how do we not only report on local issues, but raise our voices loud enough to be heard among the noise? How can local news be sure to reach the local audience? Laura, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, the macro changes are helping the public understand that the version of information that they're seeing through social media is distorted. Like fundamentally, when you're looking in the rearview mirror and it has those little words on the bottom that says things may look, larger than they appear. Social media is taking, extremism, things that exist in society, and they are massively amplifying them, which normalizes them, which is, as Patrice says, that's when it really becomes dangerous. When people start to think, wow, I didn't really think this was the way things were, but everybody else seems to think it, so now I guess I do too. The normalization of extremism through a system that is distorting information, that has to be fixed. The second thing is, Patrice used the phrase, or I think it was Hari used the phrase, we have to reclaim some space. So local media, local journalism, this country has made a commitment and recognized from the beginning that an information system was critical to making a functioning democracy. That's why the Postmaster General was a cabinet level position, because everyone needed to get newspapers, and that's why we have a postal system that delivers at a low rate to everywhere in the country. From there, we have always claimed a certain amount of the media space for the public. Libraries were established in every community through grants from philanthropy, through the Carnegie Endowment a long time ago. So there is a moment now when we have to reclaim some public, locally owned space in the communications environment systems. That is, Hari says we have a choice about how they run and how they're regulated. It is time for public to reclaim some of their own space for local communities to ensure that there's another source of news. And by the way, the platforms, the rail systems that are making all the money on moving everybody's information around right now, we're talking about, Facebook, last year getting close to 30 billion net profit. They should be required to chip in a little bit, make some room among their profit and among their platform for locally owned news generation that can be widely distributed by those platforms without filter and without distortion. I think that in there's a mix and an answer that would give us something of the kind of different world that Hari was sort of pointing at, that it doesn't have to be this way. This is all about the choices we make.
And we just have a minute or so left. The Biden infrastructure plans includes monies for broadband, so we can expand the reach to local rural areas. Good thing. What are the challenges? Hari.
Yes, I think it is a good thing. Like building the infrastructure is important, absolutely, to sort of like increase the reach. I think one of the things is that it's not so much that we talked about how we had this like crisis of disinformation because of the speed and the scale, and of course that speed and scale is afforded by the internet. But the solution is not to block access to the internet for people at all, right? But having that at that speed and scale is good. The solution instead is to figure out how do we design the kind of marketplace of information that actually works for people as opposed to working for companies, right? And so, yes, I think the infrastructure is absolutely important to reach into all communities across the country. But this question of design, I think, is a critical one that we still have to answer.
Patrice, in just a couple of seconds, the last word with you.
I think it's going to require courage on all of our parts. Courage and this commitment to our communities and saying, I live here, I want to be here, I want to make this town safe for everybody, and I'm going to find people like me who are going to do this. And, we have a resiliency guide that we build that can help get you through it, to start the process. I think there are many ways to begin, but begin and take that step. And you know there are really good people around you who want to do this too. And you know that is a force that is incredibly powerful. We've seen it over and over again in our country, and I hope we can start leveraging that in a way that we haven't, to fight this deep challenge in our country.
Thank you so much, Patrice O'Neill, Laura Quinn, and Hari Hahn. Thank you for your insight and